What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another episode of Lions Latest, going through the latest Detroit Lions news. And today, we are here to discuss the two most recent coaching hires by the Detroit Lions. So let's get it started.
Fired up. It's made a great decision.
Great teammates, coaches, and other people who want to be Super Bowl champions. And we are. We're going to do it this year.
And we're going places, because we want to go places.
Touchdown, Detroit Lions!
Before long, we're going to be the last one standing.
And welcome everybody to another video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, we have some Lions news to discuss. And today it's about coaching hirings for the Detroit Lions. And in today's video, we're going to be breaking those two down. They're really not breaking news at this point. One of these was announced yesterday. The other one was announced today. But depending on when you're watching this, and probably when you are watching this, is probably at least a day old. I mean, it could be longer than that. I don't know when you're clicking on this video, but it's probably at least a day old. So with that, this isn't necessarily breaking news. I guess unless you haven't seen it yet, then to you it's breaking news. But it is news. And I want to talk about these two coaching hirings by the Detroit Lions. Two I'm actually really excited about. One is at a position that was probably going to have to be filled because we lost a really good coach to the Carolina Panthers in Todd Wash. And the other one is kind of a new role that we've sort of had in 2021, maybe in a little bit of a different way, that has now been filled once again. But I have a theory on why I think the Lions may have done this. And I want to start with that first. So this was announced today that the Detroit Lions have hired defensive consultant John Fox. Now, this name is probably pretty familiar to a lot of NFL fans out there just in general. If it's not, you may be a little bit on the younger side. Look, I'm young for an NFL fan, but I do know John Fox, okay? I definitely know who this guy is. That is because not too long ago, he was coaching in the Super Bowl with the Denver Broncos, and he was also the head coach for the Chicago Bears. So I know who this guy is, and you probably do as well. The next guy we're going to talk about, you may know a little bit less about, but that's okay. We're going to start with John Fox first, because John Fox has been hired as a Lions defensive consultant. Now, I'm going to give you my theory on why I think that the Lions did this, and then we're going to talk about him and what he's done. So John Fox is a defensive-minded coach. That's his background. Defensive coordinator, defensive backs coach, and a head coach. He's been a head coach multiple spots. He's had a lot of success. But with the depth of his background being defensive backs coach, where that's where he started, that's what he's been for a lot of the time early in his career, is specifically working with the defensive backs. He's not coming in as our defensive backs coach, but we do have some new names that are taking on maybe bigger roles or new additions like Dre Bly to that unit. Now that Aubrey Pleasant, who was fired this past season, is no longer here, we have guys like Brian Duker who could be stepping into a bigger role. So we're going to have, I would expect, some changes there. And then as we know, Dre Bly is a new addition to this defensive backs room. And I think he's going to serve kind of the role that he did with the Indianapolis Colts in terms of he's not going to come in and say, this is how we're doing this, because he's not the coach. Instead, he's going to basically learn how we're doing things, what our philosophy is, and then he's going to give any advice, give any thoughts that he has based on what he knows. And I think this can be very beneficial, especially for a lot of these new guys, because of the amount of experience that he has, and at the same time, because this is an area that he's focused on so much. So to me, this one does make sense. Also, when you look at cornerback position, one, we are still kind of young. Two, we could have some new names coming in, whether that's the draft, whether that's free agency, whether that's trade. So I think that's a big part of this personally, because last year we didn't really have a defensive consultant, but in 2021, our first year, we had Dom Capers, and I think a lot of that was to kind of be there for Aaron Glenn, because Aaron Glenn, it was his first time as a defensive coordinator. So that's just kind of my theory. I could be off on it, but I'm sure that will help regardless. With that being said, who the heck is John Fox? If you don't know, or if you do know, but you're like, who is this guy? I don't remember. John Fox, who is he? I'm going to only talk about some of the specific moments. I'm not going to bore you by going through everywhere he's coached, because this guy has a pretty extensive background, but instead I want to point out some key things of John Fox's background with the Indianapolis Colts as their defensive consultant, and that's kind of the role that he played with the Indianapolis Colts this past year. Now, unfortunately for the Colts, statistically, defensively, they kind of took a step back really across the board. They're in a position now where it looks like they're going to draft a quarterback. They're kind of restarting over there. With that being said, one area in which they actually did improve statistically was in terms of passing yards allowed on this season. They were 12th in the National Football League from 19th the year before. So they did improve in that category. Everywhere else, they kind of got worse. Now, what you're going to notice is as I go through this, I'm going to be talking a lot about passing defensive stats. The reason is because the reason I just hit on with his defensive backs background, but also because that is an area where if you look at him and where he's been, especially as a head coach and a defensive coordinator, what you notice is the trend of the improvement of the pass defense everywhere that he's been. And obviously for the Lions, we took some massive strides as a team when Jerry got healthy, when we got our number 2 corner, when Mike Hughes got some work out there, Will Harris, his role kind of changed a little bit. We got healthier on the D-line, but we need work there. Okay, it's still ranked out as the worst defense. And like I said, there's probably going to be some new pieces, but I want to focus on that specifically because that is an area that everywhere he's been, things have improved big time with John Fox. So with that, just to touch on a couple team names, he's been a defensive coordinator for the Pittsburgh Steelers, for the Raiders, and for the Giants. He's been a head coach for the Carolina Panthers, Denver Broncos, and the Chicago Bears. We'll look at some of these defensive numbers. However, you also have to keep in mind that this is a guy that won. And what do I mean by that? Well, yeah, he won and he had winning records where he's been, but at the same time, the most impressive thing to that was his ability to turn around organizations, right? His ability to do that as a head coach is something that stands out because it wasn't always this long process. He was immediately able to make teams much better. And that starts with the Carolina Panthers as a head coach. The year before he got there, this was a 1-15 football team. The first year he became their head coach, he was a 7-9 football team. And as you can see, I throw on the screen there the last 3 years with the Carolina Panthers. But in 2003, his second year as the Carolina Panthers head coach, he had the team in the Super Bowl where he lost to New England Patriots by 3 points. Now, beyond that, it was still a team that wasn't consistently playoffs every single year. 5 of the 9 seasons that he was with the Carolina Panthers, they either finished 7-9 or 8-8, so they were kind of middle of the road for much of that. His entire record with Carolina was 73-71, but he did lead them to the Super Bowl and he did turn them around. Okay, he didn't really get them over the top or consistently make them a playoff team, but he did definitely get them back in the right direction. There's a couple things to note about John Fox, and I understand he's a little bit older now. He's widely known as a player's coach. That's an extremely loyal coach, meaning that he's loyal to his players. Never really known as a great offensive-minded coach. Now with Denver, as we're going to talk about, he did land Peyton Manning and that offense took off, but he was never really an offensive-minded coach, meaning there was always questions about how creative his offenses were, that he was running the football too much, and that's the case with a lot of defensive coaches, if you notice. A lot of defensive guys kind of lean on the run game. Let's pound the ball because that's how they can help their defense. Oh, we run the clock, control time, possession. It makes my defense better. So it makes sense that he would play that way with the Carolina Panthers. One thing that you're going to notice a lot of the time is usually the fact that his pass defense is extremely good. And one specific category that always stuck out was the yards per game allowed. And if you remember, when we looked at the stats, second half of the season pretty much, when Jerry Jacobs returned, the Lions' touchdown interception ratio was really good. It was like 14-10, right? But one thing that still struggled was the amount of yards per game the Lions were allowing passing the football. Some of that is when you're leading big, the other team's got to throw the ball. But you're still really bad there. You're giving up way too many passing yards per game. One thing that's been consistent in terms of his defensive stats has been the yards per game allowed has usually been extremely low. For whatever reason, he doesn't give up a lot of passing yards per game. So let's go to his next stop, and that is with the Denver Broncos. So with the Denver Broncos, we're talking about, again, turning a team around. So the year before he got there, 2010, Denver was 4-12. The year he got there, 2011, they finished 8-8. They win the division, the AFC West. Look, they used to dominate the AFC West. When he was there, they won the AFC West every single season. 8-8 with Tim Tebow as his quarterback. And you can see the stats on the screen on the left. 2012, this is when they acquired Peyton Manning, and that kind of stole the show. But you can see the improvement that the defense took. Top 10 in all those categories. Points per game allowed, passer rating allowed, completion percentage allowed, and passing yards per game was under 200 with 25 touchdowns allowed, to a massive leap in interceptions forced defensively. 13-3 this year and lost in the divisional round. The next season they went 13-3 again. This time they lost in the Super Bowl. But as you notice, the defense took a little bit of a step back. Just a little bit. It took a little bit of a step back. So John Fox basically kind of just said to himself, I would assume, because this is kind of what the offseason moves indicated, we're getting back to fixing this defense, okay? Because that's what he is. He's a defensive-minded guy. So he's like, I'm going to fix this defense. We're going to get back there because I'm going to fix this defense, because it was coming off of a Super Bowl loss, 48-3. And you understand that the that game was, the hype was, it was offense versus defense, right? It was like the best offense historically versus the historically best defense in Seattle. And as a defensive coach, I just got to put myself in his shoes and be like, what the heck just happened? That's not going to happen. I'm the defensive guy. So he went out and he invested. He drafted Bradley Roby in the first round. He signed Aqib Talib. He made DeMarcus Ware was brought in. He made some splashes in free agency. That led to his final season with the Denver Broncos in 2014, where you can see, again, statistically, you could argue that statistically they got better again defensively in terms of, again, look at the yards per game. Now it's top 10 once again. They were top half pretty much every category there, but the defense definitely got better in that season. However, unfortunately for them, they lost in the divisional round that year, and that's when he and the Denver Broncos mutually agreed to part ways. Now, the next season, they would actually go on to win the Super Bowl. John Fox had them right there, but they were just not getting over the top, and that's what John Elway wanted. The next season, they did that with Gary Kubiak, but the issue is that after that, things pretty much fell apart, and the Broncos have been trying to really figure it out since that time. So his next stop then was with the Chicago Bears, and again, as a Lions fan, we see this all the time, the Chicago Bears. We understand that this has been a team that's been kind of just known for defense. Like, you think of the Bears and you think I mean, that's what it's always been with Chicago, to be honest, okay? I mean, it's really always been that. You know, I heard today that Chicago's never had a 4,000 passing yard season from a starting quarterback. I was like, that can't be true. That cannot be true. I think it's actually true. Okay, I didn't do a super deep dive, but I'm pretty sure it's actually true. Jay Cutler didn't, at least, so I know that. Like, that's pretty insane. He was known for bringing pressure defensively, all the different ways he could attack you as an offense, and you can see where they ranked out defensively, and you can see in his final year that he was there, 7th in terms of yards per game allowed, and 9th in terms of points per game allowed. There's a big-time connection here that I want to hit on with John Fox back with the Chicago Bears. That's a clear connection to something that Aaron Glenn talks about a lot, but we also know is a tree that he comes from, because he always likes to work with guys that are kind of in the same tree, and that is Vic Fangio. So we talk about Vic Fangio a lot, a guy that's been a consultant, but now he's a defensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins, so you can't hire that guy. So instead, you go get John Fox, and yes, there was a reported rift between the two in 2016, but they continued to work together the next season. However, when he was there with the Chicago Bears, John Fox added Vic Fangio from the San Francisco 49ers, who helped them turn their defense around. The same role with the Chicago Bears as their defensive coordinator. And statistically speaking, like John Fox brought up when he was asked about it, they took massive strides. The year before he got to Chicago, their defense was 30th in yards allowed and 31st in points. And I know you see the passing stats on the screen, but the very first season he was there, they were 14th in yards allowed. The next season, 15th in yards allowed. And in his final season with Chicago, they were 10th in yards allowed. So they took massive steps from where they were before he got there. So that's a very clear connection to touch on. Also, in those years, the year before he got there, they drafted Kyle Fuller, who did not have the best rookie season. But under John Fox, he took huge strides. I mean, his second season, his first season with Fox, he was a very good corner. His final season with Fox, he was extremely good. He did not play in the 2016 season, which probably has something to do with the fact that, you know, they didn't take a big stride, or they didn't necessarily take a step in terms of total yards allowed. But also during that time, they did add Eddie Goldman in the second round, and he was pretty much a stud when healthy. They also added Leonard Floyd in the first round in 2016, and in 2017 in the fourth round, they picked up Eddie Goldman. Okay, defensive mind. Now, as John Fox put it when he joined the Chicago Bears, that they were going to run a 3-4, and here's the biggest thing, and I think he said it really well. You know, sometimes from the outside looking in, this can become like something that's huge, but he said a lot of times the spacing is similar, and I think that's the case. A lot of times you get teams that are hybrid, you get teams that adjust a lot, and I think this is very important to bring up because I started to dive into last year, and while I think the Lions may look to address certain player types, you have to keep in mind the flexibility that a lot of teams are going to end up working with, whether that's because of personnel, whether that's because certain guys step up, or the team you're playing. I mean, just looking at last year, take a look at Chicago, for example, a 3-4 over front to try to protect some of the outside runs. You got your two stand-up edge rushers getting a little bit more speed on the field in James Houston and Aiden Hutchinson. And in the words of John Fox, the benefit there, side of running like a 4-3, is that now you don't necessarily have to, you don't know which rusher is going to rush, because primarily in a 3-4, usually you have enough athleticism to drop. And in our case, James can drop, Hutch can drop, right? When you're running a 4-3, a lot of times that standard defensive end isn't going to drop into coverage, okay? Now, you might walk up a linebacker to the line of scrimmage, and that Sam linebacker might be able to rush or drop, but that's not really having the same threat as the other defensive end who's just rushing the passer in a 4-3. But with that being said, like he said, when he was with Pittsburgh, we ran a 3-4, but that's something that does cross over a ton, and a lot of teams kind of do that. Like, so the Lions, they ran a 3-3-5 look at times against the Green Bay Packers. They liked a lot of times to show some over fronts, meaning putting that 3-tech towards the strong side of the field, while at the same time, though, again, sometimes they ran under fronts defense. Games like Carolina, where the Lions showed a wide 9 look for both of their defensive ends. So they gave you a lot of different looks based on personnel, based on who they were playing. I still think the Lions need that penetrating 3-tech this offseason because I still think they're kind of missing that. Like against Green Bay, like the 3-3-5 look, they may put Benito Jones in that role. I still think they could use someone like that, but he's right in terms of, that can be made a lot of, but the point is that there's usually a lot of kind of flexibility between the two. Fangio that he has, because again, you're staying in that same tree of which the Lions have tried to kind of stick with defensively. And sure, if they could have gotten Fangio, sure, they would like him as a consultant, but John Fox, who worked with him and is a defensive-minded coach, and you got to remember, John Fox defenses, they're known for, bringing pressure, bringing that fifth rusher, not sure where it's coming from, that's the benefit of a 3-4, while at the same time, they are a tough defense. Like, there is a kind of a stigma that comes with a John Fox type of defense, with the toughness that they're going to play, the discipline which they are going to play with, and you just anticipate it's going to get better pretty darn quickly in a hurry. And again, pass defense is kind of his specialty in my opinion, and I think that's a huge thing that he brings to the Lions. So I'm excited about this John Fox hiring. I think this is big time, and I think he's going to serve a little bit of a different role, but with new faces, this is helpful. And I think especially with new faces that we're probably going to have via additions this offseason in terms of player personnel, I think this could be massive for the Lions. So I love this hiring. I'm a fan of John Fox. Next coach we're going to be discussing is the Lions. It's seemingly our new defensive line coach. By the time I'm recording this, I'm not sure if it's actually been confirmed that this is going to be his position on the Detroit Lions staff, but I would assume that it is. The Lions do have assistant defensive line coach Cameron Davis that is still here, so I guess potentially he could become that guy, but I would assume he's becoming our defensive line coach because he is coming from Penn State, where he was their defensive line coach / run game coordinator. So I'd assume he's just going to be our defensive lines coach. He's been this in a couple of different spots, specifically in college. He hasn't been a defensive line coach in the NFL outside of being an assistant defensive line coach. I think there's still a lot of big time things to point out here, and I think it all ties into what we just said with John Fox in terms of the schematic things, where he's coming from, and I'm going to try to hit on some of those things for sure. So who is John Scott Jr.? Well, this is a guy that has plenty of experience, and he's also, again, a former player. So John Scott Jr. played his college football at Western Carolina as a defensive end. And from the stat that I found, I don't know if this still holds up, but at least at the time, he finished with the 10th most tackles for loss in history for Western Carolina with 31. He played in the CFL and also in the Arena Football League, and at the same time he was an Arena Football player, he also got his coaching start as a defensive line coach at the high school level. His next stop was then Louisiana Lafayette as a graduate assistant, then with Norfolk State as their defensive line coach, then back to his alma mater with Western Carolina as a defensive end / outside linebacker coach. I want to stop right here for a second because this is something that you do notice when you look at where he's been. There's been a couple of stops where it's been more specific of saying maybe he works with defensive end / outside linebackers, or maybe he works with defensive tackles more specifically. And I think the reason that's important is because, again, you get a lot of that crossover, especially when you have flexibility within your defensive end / outside linebackers, edge rushers, or edge defenders. And the same thing with Todd Wash, where sometimes you still work with those guys as well. So I think it's important to kind of talk about that. He has that background, plus he's played defensive end, but he has that background of working with those positions individually, which I think will be very beneficial for him and kind of the versatility that we have defensively of him working in those spots. Now, he became the full defensive line coach for Western Carolina in 2008. In that same year, not sure exactly what time, attended the Minority Coaching Academy, and he was actually selected amongst 400 applicants. So I thought that was something that kind of stuck out there. His next stop would be with Missouri State. Now we're talking specifically as, again, kind of that defensive end / outside linebacker coach. And his stop after that was with Georgia Southern as their special teams coach / defensive line coach. Now, again, I want to stop here because one thing that's going to be brought up about John Scott Jr. is the talent that he's worked with, the amount of All-Americans that he's worked with, the amount of players that have been put into the league that he's worked with, whether big schools or small schools, was something that was brought up by a coach that was interviewing him for their defensive line position. So I want to stop here because that's worthy of note with Georgia Southern. As he worked with 2 All-Americans, including Brent Russell, who was all years that he worked with John Scott Jr., a All-American player who also, at least at the time, not again sure if this is still the case, but at least at the time, he was the program's all-time leading sacker. That sounded very weird. All-time sack leader. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that backward. His next stop then was with Texas Tech, and this was a pretty big leap as their defensive line coach, who at the time, their head coach was Cliff Kingsbury. We know that he has been in the NFL recently with the Arizona Cardinals. And with Texas Tech, he worked with a couple of guys that I'm sure you're familiar with. Kerry Hyder, who was an all Big 12 player, and also Brandon Jackson, who got an invite to the NFL Combine and had arguably his best season under John Scott Jr. His next stop beyond that was to the NFL level, first as a defensive quality control coach, then as the assistant defensive line coach. With the New York Jets, he worked under Todd Bowles as their head coach. Also Pepper Johnson, who was their full-time defensive line coach at the time when he became their assistant defensive line coach. He is also a former player, just to kind of point that out. And by the way, that defensive line that he was a part of was outstanding. I mean, they had some moving pieces. You had guys like Steve McClendon, who were coming in. That was kind of an underrated signing that had his best pass rushing season, arguably, of his career in his first year there with the New York Jets, while also being surrounded with one of the best defensive fronts that the year before, when he was the quality control coach, they were 3rd in the league in yards per carry allowed, 2nd in the league in yards per game allowed rushing, and 13th in the league in sacks. Now those stats took a little bit of a step back the next year, 4th in terms of yards per carry, 11th in terms of yards per game rushing allowed, and 29th in terms of sacks. But you still had a stacked and loaded defensive line that included Leonard Williams, who upped his sacks from 3 to 7. You also had Muhammad Wilkerson, who took a pretty big dip in terms of the sack production that he had. Sheldon Richardson, kind of the same thing as well, but it was a loaded defensive front, one of the best front sevens in football. It was with Arkansas, and this is an area where he was kind of noted for specifically working with the defensive tackle position, even though he was also named their defensive line coach, but that was kind of a spot that he specifically was kind of noted for with Arkansas. So again, I bring that up because, again, you're talking about defensive ends, outside linebackers, now specifically working with the defensive tackles. And then after that, for 2 seasons, he went to South Carolina as their defensive line coach, and this is what their coach had to say, the South Carolina coach said, about the interview that he had with John Scott Jr. He said this. Now, since we are kind of in draft mode, we're talking draft, I thought I would at least throw this in here, and then we'll get to kind of what the coach said about John here. But he did work with Zach Pickens, who is the guy I do like in this year's draft, a 5-star, and he's worked with a lot of top-end athletes, whether that was with Penn State, Arkansas, South Carolina most recently. But Zach Pickens was one of those guys who he said kind of had a junior's type of body, basically as a freshman. So I'll throw this little clip in there, and then we'll get to what the head coach of South Carolina said about John Scott Jr.
Well, for me personally, some of the places that I've been, he's got really, really good size and strength for a freshman coming in. He's got like a junior body right now as a freshman, so that certainly helps. So for him, just developing the mental part, and that's coming. I feel like he's doing a good job with that. And now just getting the technique down.
I was very impressed with John during a lengthy interview that I conducted with him. He is a very detailed-oriented and what I would call a grinder. He also has an NFL background and has experience coaching elite players, something that was very important to me. He's a good fit for our staff. Now, this is something that not only the coach brought up, but also players at Penn State have brought up as well. The fact that he's worked at the coaching ranks in the NFL is something that college players felt like were very beneficial to them, because he knew what it would take to play at that level and what that kind of player looked like. So for him, he could coach them that way and say, hey, this is what it's going to look like at the next level, so this is how you're going to be prepared. And to speak to that, there's a lot of players that he's worked with that have gotten to the next level. Specifically, there's been a lot of draft picks that have gotten to the next level. So the next stop, of course, is with Penn State, and he's been there for the last 3 seasons as their defensive line coach. In his past year, he picked up also being their run game coordinator before now going to Detroit. And it's kind of late in the process. Usually this is a little bit later. Spring games are kind of right around the corner for these types of, for the teams in the college football level. But I'm going to show you guys a little list here. These are the players that have been drafted that he's worked with. You can see Penn State, Arnold Ebiketie, 2nd round pick. Shaka Toney, 7th round pick. Both defensive ends. Odafe Owe, 1st round pick, and it was a 1st round pick in a very long time for Penn State. Also, on top of that, while guys like Owe weren't the most polished players coming out, he was a little bit more of an athletic upside, a guy that didn't have any sacks in 2020. He had 5 the year before, but some of that was because of a shortened season. The foot counter ability that he showcased, the upside as potentially being a really good run defender that he showcased, and he had a really nice season, a really good rookie season for the Baltimore Ravens. Then you had guys like Arnold Ebiketie, who showed some really nice polish in terms of maybe his hand usage and his ability to get after the quarterback there as well. South Carolina, Javon Kinlaw, 1st round pick for the San Francisco 49ers. DJ Wanham, 6th round pick there. Armand Watts, when we talk about working with defensive tackle specifically, Armand Watts was a draft pick by the Minnesota Vikings as a defensive tackle. So again, you can see that he's worked with a lot of NFL talent and he's helped develop a lot of that NFL talent, which is something that I think is worth noting. Guys like PJ Mustipher, who could be drafted this season, a defensive tackle, the guy that brought up the fact that he was a guy that joked around a lot, but he knew when to basically lock in, and the fact that he had coached at the NFL level, you know, we knew that he knew what it looked like and what you had to look like to play at that level, so he could get us to lock in. And I think that's one thing that you have to note. As much as some guys maybe didn't come out always the most developed, you always have to recognize that the case was, specifically at Penn State with a lot of these guys and with Mustipher, is their effort level and the fact that they would lock in. These are guys that have incredible motors. Owe, incredible motor. Mustipher, incredible motor. Like, that's what they have. They play with that level of intensity. So that's the case. They were NFL impact players in that sense. You knew they were going to be ready in that sense to play in the NFL and basically hit the ground running, which is the case, and we'll see if that's the case with Mustipher, but I think that's something that you have to bring up. Also, another thing he was credited with big time heavily at Penn State was some of the transfers that they brought in, meaning guys that were already playing at the collegiate level that were able to hit the ground running. Knock to that recruiting side was, you know, he had knocks in the past, like with Texas Tech, where he was a younger coach, and that was something that was known of it. Maybe they didn't recruit as well as they would have liked to on the defensive line. With Penn State, while they necessarily didn't always get that big nose tackle that they would have liked to land, Angelos, the Robinson, the guys that would be able to come in, be very disciplined, run defenders, that kind of thing. When you speak about the schematic side, and I won't spend too long here, but I definitely see that this guy would kind of fit into the more attacking style defensively with their defensive linemen, but not necessarily just closing their eyes and shooting gaps, more attack and react style, specifically on the strong side of the field, you know, or the play side, I guess you would say, more just kind of attack and react, but being clearly a one gap style defense, a lot of times kind of running that 4-man front. First off, with Penn State, he worked with Brent Pry as their defense coordinator, who's now the defense coordinator for Virginia Tech, who ran, and he kind of had the background of a 4-4 front background, but he was a one gap style defensive coach, the ability to get pressure from the field, you know, on third downs, kind of give you those mug looks, you know, the double A gap looks, and you know, kind of do some backside stunts, you know, that were kind of naturally happen. You see it a lot in the NFL, kind of, he called them the egg stunts, where they would kind of naturally happen based on how the offensive line played it. 2022, this past season, where he worked with Manny Diaz, who players were immediately saying, you know, as of his arrival, how they liked the aggressive scheme that he was utilizing. I think you saw a lot of carryover in terms of how the Lions like to do things defensively. Again, the one gap style, but attack and react style. You saw some of the 3-tech/2-eye looks from the 2 interior defensive linemen or their defensive tackles. You also saw a lot of the 4-2-5 looks where you'd get some of the 3-tech/2-eye defensively. You also got some of the creative like 3-4 types of look where you get like the single stand-up rusher, a 3-tech 2-eye, and then a 5-tech on the field as well. You got a nice little mix between the overlooks defensively, the underlooks defensively, but mainly coming from kind of that same tree of we're going to be attack, we're going to also react off of that, we're not going to just shoot gaps blindly, but we are an attacking style defense that's an aggressive defense, and this is again where you kind of tie into the using the 5 rushers, and this is something that the Lions, which is a team that I think you have to bring up directly to this, did a lot. Same thing with John Fox, the 5 rushers, okay, while it's still technically a blitz, the Lions did this a ton. The reason they did this this because, again, they would use one less underneath zone defender and bring 5 rushers, and a lot of times that was just a 5th guy on the line of scrimmage. So while before with Brent Pry, you saw kind of that field pressure that he liked to bring, whether that was from the slot cornerback, that kind of thing. With Manny Diaz, you saw a lot of the slant rushing. You saw a lot of the movement with the defensive line. So you get stunt work, things like that, but you get a lot of slant rushing, shooting gaps in that way, utilizing the linebackers. And again, that's something that the Lions do. They like to slant rush. We saw it with their slot cornerbacks. They like to do things like that. They like to move their defensive line as well. I think schematically, I could definitely see how this guy makes sense for the Detroit Lions. I think that was pretty clear. And at the same time, just the kind of guys that he's produced. Now, the recruiting side hasn't always maybe been his best friend, but that's less of the case in the NFL. But one thing is for sure, getting guys up to speed very quickly is there, and also having guys NFL ready is something that was very noticeable. And for a guy that's working at the college level, that can, I could assume, be a very big issue, but he has gotten guys ready for the NFL, and we have seen that. So I think that's why you would want to believe that he's going to translate pretty well. And again, some of these stylistic things just kind of make sense for the NFL level. So now he is a Detroit Lion. He's our defensive line coach, I'm assuming, and I'm assuming he is our starting defensive line coach. So that is kind of my take there. Not as much information as maybe I would like to give you guys, but we can always revisit this. But I'm excited about both of these, and specifically John Fox, because he has a very large background and he's had a lot of success. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, Pride, for watching, and I'm out.